up on a whale ship. He wrote, "A farmer's golden harvest in autumn is not a pleasanter sight to him than it is to a whaler to have his decks and blubber room blubber log. The try works ablazing day, cooper a poundin', oil a flowin', everybody busy and dirty night and day." Donkey loads of Chilean or Peruvian gold filing into the custom house at Valparaiso and Lima, or bags of the Californian dust riding into San Francisco, have no such charms for him as cutting in 100-barrel whale and turning out oil by the hogshead. For whalers, whaling offered opportunities for advancement. And when you combined those opportunities with savvy female money management, you could really get fundamental improvements in the quality of life for Native families. Deep sea whalers were paid in wages through a lay system, and that system deducted the price of food and other goods which were purchased from the laborer's final cut of the profits. You may be more familiar with this system in mining communities. Um, as these whalers rose through the ranks, the opportunity for accruing savings increased. And it's really important to note that whaling voyages were often 4, sometimes as long as 5 or 6 years long. So I know we spoke briefly about the sperm whale just a moment ago. This was one of the most prized types of whales to take for whalers. Sperm whales are known for their very large head, and sperm whales dive down very, very deep to eat those giant squid. For them to compensate and deal with the intense pressures and very low temperatures of the ocean at such low depths, they have a great deal of oil which surrounds their brain. And as they dive down, this hardens into wax. This great amount of oil and this very pure oil was key for the whalers. It formed candles much cleaner, and just the quantity alone made this whale the one that they wanted to take. In his book, The Whale and His Captors, Henry Cheever recounts a day at sea on a whale ship. He states, "For the first time in now our 10 weeks passage from the Hawaiian Islands, on this New Zealand cruising ground, we heard, day before yesterday, that life-kindling sound to a weary whaleman. There she blows. The usual questions and orders from the deck followed quickly. Where away? 2 points on the weather bow. How far off? 1.5 miles. Keep your eye on her. 3 boats' crews pulled merrily away, glad of something to stir their blood, and with eager hope to obtain the oily material wherewith to fill their ship and make good their lay. The whale was going leisurely to windward, blowing every now and again 2 or 3 times, then turning tail up flukes and sinking. The ships headed after him, keeping a distance of nearly 1/4 mile from each other to scatter, as it was called, their chances." Cheever goes on to describe the chase. Upon reaching the whale, all the harpooner in the bow had to do was to plunge his 2 keen cold irons, which are always secured to one tow line, to the monster's blubber sides. Upon being harpooned, the whale took off, dragging the boat along with him. And this process is actually just, it's called a Nantucket sleigh ride. And that is when the whale is swimming and pulling the whale boat behind it. And when we're talking about this boat, we're talking about the smaller boat that you see right in front of the whale, not the larger ship behind it. Once the whale was tired out, it would be killed and its body would be secured to the whale ship. The crew would cut into the carcass to remove the blubber and process it down to oil. I'm sure you can see that this would be a very dangerous process. It's very slippery. The men are balancing on planks over the open ocean. And as they're cutting into the whale, scraps are falling to the water below. And of course, there are sharks in that water. And these men would be working day and night with very sharp instruments on the open ocean. So this whale ship was a really masculinized place with a rigid onboard hierarchy. Living conditions were filthy and cramped. Whalers proved their bravery by fighting ocean storms and battling large whales. Whale hunts were very dangerous undertakings and often resulted in a human loss of life. Whale ships did not carry doctors. The captain often acted as a surrogate physician or surgeon, and he used carpentry tools for both amputations and tooth extractions. Later on, as whaling declined in the latter part of the 19th century, fishermen scoured the waters surrounding Long Island for Manhattan and worked in 15 oil factories on the island to try out the oil from the fish. So they're using these same processes that men on the whale ship would use Along the southern shore of Long Island, Long Islanders harvested shellfish and fished commercially for bluefish, mackerel, and codfish. So that kind of sets the scene for what the men are doing at this point in time. And now we're going to focus on the women on land. So in the 1850s and 60s, back on land, Long Island Native women built mechanisms of survival, which allowed family members to work and to thrive in these industries that required labor-related absence. So the women at home fit external work smoothly into their home economy to keep everything functioning while their male relatives were away. Cynthia Walker Bunn is the first woman we're going to speak about today, and she was a Shinnecock woman born on Long Island in approximately 1803. She lived in Southampton with her husband, David Bunn, a boatman, and she worked as a seamstress. So seamstresses were actually one of the most exploited portions of the working class. They worked very long hours with very low pay. And they're often caught in this double bind. They needed a financial income to supplement their husband's earnings, but they were also shackled to the home by childcare. Cynthia and other local seamstresses invested their time and energy into both domestic work and childcare. By 1865, Cynthia and her husband had moved to the Shinnecock Reservation, and David Bunn had transitioned from maritime work into farming. Later in life, Cynthia sought out and found employment keeping house. One really important thing to note about Cynthia, her earning power contributed significantly to her family's ability to purchase property and permanently settle upon it. During the early 1800s, Native people on Long Island gradually abandoned wigwams and instead adopted Euro-American frame houses. By 1865, Cynthia and her family lived in a frame house valued at about $300. And this photo here does show what working as a seamstress in a facility would look like. Elizabeth Thunderbird Haley, a Shinnecock woman who did an oral history with historian Nancy Shoemaker, shed light on the close link between frame houses and the whaling industry. And she stated there are houses on Shinnecock that were built with whaling money. About 200 years ago, most of them have fallen down. The house next to mine was built by Wickham Cuffey in the 1800s. Uncle Wick himself was born in a wigwam. So archaeologists, especially Emily Button, working at Shinnecock, have shown that the residents had the purchasing power not only to live in Euro-American houses, but to integrate popular European goods into their daily practices. As in other areas of the country, Native peoples selectively incorporated aspects of Anglo-American material, in this case, frame houses, and behavior, sedentary life, into their lifeways to survive in a colonial environment. Um, Cynthia and her husband undertook reproductive work as a very large family of members of Shinnecock Nation and able-bodied workers for these industries we've been discussing. The couple had 5 children together: Franklin, Mary, Thomas, George, and Abraham. Um, Now, it is important to note that maritime industries were very risky to Native communities who were attempting to survive culturally in a colonial atmosphere. So Cynthia invested time, energy, and self into her family. Her wages allowed her to provide for her children's physical bodies and their civic development. Um, but even so, she lost 2 sons to the sea. Abraham was lost at sea, and Franklin perished in the Circassian disaster. Um, this shipwreck is pretty well known, and we're actually going to touch on it again later. But on December 30th, 1876, their Circassian sank off Bridgehampton in a storm. Local lifesavers attempted to rescue the crew and salvage the cargo, and 11 Shinnecock men, which was most of the whaling generation, perished as the ship broke apart. And maritime disasters such as these signaled a wide community loss, a great personal loss for the families involved, but it also goes to demonstrate the importance of these large families to ensure community survival in these colonial times and atmospheres and systems. So we're going to go on to talk about Mary Bunley. And Mary Bunley was Cynthia's daughter. And she really drew from her mother's example. She did employ some of the same strategies to survive and thrive during her life. She was born in 1839, And she also drew on kinship systems to navigate the male labor related absences of her husband and her brothers in law. Mary Bunn married Milton Lee, and he was a seaman from Southampton. Milton was one of five seafaring brothers from a very well known Long Island family of whalers. Historian Nancy Shoemaker calls the Lee family the most illustrious Shinnecock whaling family of the 19th century and argues that the Lee brothers' experiences reveal much about the significance of whaling in the economy and the culture of the Shinnecock community. Milton first went to sea at the age of 17 on the Panama. On the Panama, Milton sailed with 10 Shinnecock men. Five were from the Cuffey family, two were from the Bunn family, two were from the Eliezer family. And on the ship, Shinnecocks actually made up 1/3 of the ship's crew, which just goes to tell you how important this industry was to this community. One of Milton's brothers later was even promoted to captain on another voyage, and Milton himself reached the rank of first mate at the age of 25. So whalers like Milton Lee depended on the labor of female family members on land. And mothers, sisters, nieces, grandmothers, wives, and daughters all helped whalers prepare for their voyage by packing a sea chest. And I do have an example of that on the screen. Whalers pack supplies to last the duration of their voyage because remember, missing or forgotten items could be purchased from the ship's store, but it would be at a very high cost. And you didn't want to deduct too much from your wages where you actually ended up owing money to the captain and needing to sign on for another voyage. Due to the wide geographic range of these voyages, sea chests had to contain suitable clothing for both the tropics and polar regions. Um, so the women at home, they invest time, energy, and work into properly preparing their male relatives for this journey because preparation in the end would give the family a much better financial outlook. So female labor on land also kept the communities functioning in the absence of the whaling men, because remember, these men are gone for 4 to 5 years at a time, and you had to keep your daily life up as well. Um, this fact was not limited to Long Island. In Nantucket, women married to seafarers sought to make an active contribution to family finances by drawing upon traditional female responsibilities to earn money. So these women produced, prepared, and preserved food. They spun, wove, washed, and sewed. They nursed the sick, they took in boarders, they ran retail shops, twisted twine, and taught school. And while Milton was at sea, Mary worked as a maid and a housekeeper in the houses of some of Eastern Long Island's most elite families, actually including Theodore Roosevelt. And by 1865, Mary and Milton lived in a frame house valued at $800 with their son, Milton Jr. So it cannot be understated that a whaling contract was not only a 4 to 5 year commitment for the whaler, but also an investment of time, labor, and faith by families at home. Many of these men never came home. Before the abolition of slavery, non-white whalers risked seizure at ports in the southern United States and other international locations. Other men voluntarily jumped ship, deserted, and were absorbed into other communities. Also on whaling voyages, men died by drowning, storms, ice injury, and disease. And Milton Lee did die at sea in 1869. So in situations of such precarity, community connections were really everything. Milton and Mary lived very near to her parents. Census data suggests that the two families were able to function as emotional and physical support in times of trouble. Um, Interestingly, despite his father's death at sea, Milton Jr. sailed on a whaling voyage to Greenland, and he later organized community networks to sustain old whalers. Much like the female networks of support created by women such as Cynthia and Mary, men like Milton Jr. Created male mechanisms of support as well, and that was physical and financial support. Mary later married a man named Andrew Kellis, and I found that she was known as Aunt Becky to members of the Shinnecock community later on in life. So we're going to move on to our third woman that we're going to speak about today, and her name was Maria Fowler Farrow. She was a Montaukett woman from the eastern tip of Long Island. And all three of these women had probably encountered each other at the June meeting, which was an annual religious event which brought together the different Native groups of Long Island. Much like Cynthia and Mary, Maria contributed to the survival of her community through cultural and physical labor. So when Maria married David Farrow, she married into a large network of seafaring male relatives with the tendency to collapse households into each other in times of need. Demographically, whaling fit really well into Montaukett household cycles. Multiple adult laborers and family units often moved into the same household. By 1865, David Farrow's dwelling contained two separate households within the same house. Maria lived with her husband, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, and mother-in-law. 5 years later, by 5 years later, the households had split. So David's mother had moved into her daughter's house, and Maria lived with her husband and their children, 7-year-old Wyandank, 4-year-old Maggie, 2-year-old Samuel, and 5-month-old Eliezer. As in the case of Cynthia Walker, Maria lived very close to her father, his wife, and 4 of their children. After her husband's death from tuberculosis in 1878, Maria supported her family by washing for summer boarders at Stratton's and doing domestic work. Historian Tara Hunter's work on the lives and labor of washerwomen in the Reconstruction South actually provides for us a really interesting viewpoint. Hunter's work provides insight into how washing trades actually worked inside that household rhythm. Laundry work provided flexibility, and as laundresses worked within the home, they could provide childcare and incorporate help from other women. Maria also worked as a domestic servant. Domestic servants were responsible for a whole bunch of different tasks. They changed linen, washed floors, dusted, prepared the wash, polished silver, took care of the children, emptied chamber pots, and greeted guests. Um, Domestic work also provided opportunities for socialization. So domestic servants like Maria would meet together in the street or the park to gossip and socialize while tending to their mistress's children. Maria's wages, really importantly, allowed her to provide for her children even after her husband's death. One Long Island journalist recounted, poor as she manages to keep a neat rag on the floor of her cabin and an argon lamp and porcelain shade on the table, while her children are better fed and clothed than any other Montauk. During the winter months, her son hunted and was often successful enough to keep the family in pork and cornmeal for a week. She recognized her son Wyandank's role as a future Montaukett leader, and she saw the advantages of having a Western formal education in a colonially oppressive atmosphere. So in 1879, local wealthy landowner Arthur Benson bought land at Montauk with the intention of developing the area into a hunting preserve. So he authorized the purchase of land in Freetown, and he planned to offer those plots of land to those still living at Indian Fields in Montauk in return for the sale of Montaukett residence rights to the land. Benson had agreed to pay for the education of all of Maria's children should she sign, but he later failed to follow through on his promise. Now, as we know, much of the stories that we've already spoken about today has been drawn from census records. Census records can be a really great historic tool, but it's important to speak about what comes with using census records as, your only evidence. So census takers walked door to door throughout the neighborhood in history and today and took down demographic information. Census enumerations are performed by individual human census takers, and they are subjective data that are often masked as objective data. So these records do contain really valuable historical information, but historians must examine these records with the same critical eye that we use for other documents. One really important note is, as a patriarchal society, census records provide us with a really inaccurate image of women's labor in the past. So research economist Peter Meyer suggests that 19th century women were expected to be dependents. As such, they were often not counted as having an occupation despite taking in work. So the women that we've already spoken about often did not appear with any sort of job or show any contribution to the household if we only looked at census records. So we have to keep that in mind as we think of women's labor in the past, because there is so much that slips through the cracks that we may not get from just looking at a few different types of sources. So now we're going to move on to speaking about the women who work behind the scenes. So in Long Island Native communities, female labor allowed men to pursue employment which necessitated geographic distance and removal from the physical community. Many Native women labored behind the scenes, and this allowed men to pursue whaling, fishing, and military service. And these different industries are interconnected because the families who had learned through their experience of whaling brought these strategies to work with military work and fishing. In this section, I'm going to talk about Warren Coffey, and he's the man that's pictured on the screen. But I'm going to do it by discussing the women who birthed him, raised him, married him, supported him, and ultimately buried him. Um, and this is to show that women were present in every aspect of male work. Women's labor set up the conditions which allowed these men to act within maritime, militaristic, and political spheres. So um, Warren Coffey is a really interesting character too, and we'll get to that. Um, First, we're going to focus on his mother. So Louisa Cotton was born in New York City in approximately 1819 to a French father and a Shinnecock mother. She married Jason Cuffey, a descendant of the famous Montauk preacher Paul Cuffey. The couple began having children in the early 1840s, a historical setting which you really get to see the interplay of civic duty, personal finances, and community sentiment. And she gave birth to Warren in 1843. So Warren labored in traditionally masculine spaces, chiefly the military, fishing, and life saving. And he would not have been able to pursue these paths had it not been for his mother and his wife and the women who supported those women. His service as a soldier in the Civil War had both immediate financial and long term cultural memory contributions to his community. Um, as a fisherman, he also brought food into his home to ensure survival at the family level. And as a lifesaver, he answered a call for civic duty with ultimately fatal results. So the Civil War loomed very large in his mother's life. The historical memory of anti slavery fervor in Sag Harbor is pervasive. Local folklore even holds that the St. David AME Zion Church in Eastville was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Louisa's husband, Jason, was involved in the construction of this church, and Warren was a member. Louisa performed work for the church through the organization of events, preparation of food, and dissemination of religious teaching. She became a Civil War mother in 1863 when 20-year-old Warren enlisted in the 20th Regiment, United States Colored Infantry of the Union Army, as a private for a term of 3 years. So we have to remember that military service is gendered labor and affects the gendering of labor at home. Native mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters had already adapted through their experience with whaling to dealing with male labor related absence. So Louisa's work at home kept the household running while Warren went to war. Um, and as we know from other wars, war has an undeniable impact on how individuals negotiate their role in society. And when men go off to war, women often step in to fill those roles in the meantime. So life went on in East Hampton, even as the war raged to the south. Community involvement in the Civil War likely resulted in this reorganization at the home level for many people living in East Hampton. Louisa lived with her husband and three of her children, who ranged from a newborn to 14 years old. And the women in these soldiering and whaling families drew on those older community networks to sustain their families. During the war, Louisa actually sent one of her sons to live in his paternal grandfather's household with his grandfather, grandmother, uncle, and aunt. And that son helped to keep that household running while some of the older sons were away. So wives, mothers, and grandparents found support through large nuclear families and close extended families. After the war, Warren and his wife Sophia worked in tandem to support the household. By 1870, Warren lived on the Shinnecock Reservation with his wife, their 3-year-old son Eugene, and 4-month-old daughter Sophia. Warren was a fisherman, and the elder Sophia worked as a housekeeper. In the 1870s, the Long Island fishing industry was booming. And this is sort of at the tail end of the golden age of whaling in Long Island. So Long Island whaling after 1850 took a sharp decline. One of the reasons is that many Long Island whale ships were actually used to blockade southern ports, and that's referred to as the Old Stone Fleet. I believe they were in Charleston and a few of the other Confederate ports, and they were purposely sunk there to block the harbors. Um, so after the war, people are using the same technology that they use to extract oil from whales, and they're actually getting it from Manhattan. So these small fish on the screen right here. So 15 oil factories on the east end of Long Island employed a capital of nearly $500,000, 400 men, 105 sailing boats, and 2 steamers. And these factories cropped up to try out the oil from these fish. Well-provisioned factories could work approximately 200,000 fish per week. Um, and of course, these figures do not take into account the other extractive Long Island maritime ventures going on at the same time on the south shore of Long Island. So that's clamming, oystering, fishing for bluefish, mackerel, codfish, and whales, or subsistence fishing. So, like many other Native women, Sophia played a really critical role in her husband's work. So, historians have recently undertaken really interesting scholarship on the critical role of marriage in fishing communities. So, there's an English historian named Martin Wilcox, and he looked at the lives of fishermen in fishing villages in England between 1500 and 1815. And he noticed that fishing required the participation of the entire family. Women and children at home baited long lines, gathered shellfish, repaired nets, and sold fish. They maintained their husband's gear, they packed food. So, interdisciplinary studies have also explored the ways in which women contributed to their husband's fishing through these visible and invisible forms of work. In the Western Australian fishing industry, Fishermen's wives, fishermen's wives managed their husband's finances and did underpaid and undervalued labor. In the Cuffey household, Sophia's work behind the scenes likely gave Warren an advantage over unmarried fishermen or fishermen without these large families that could jump in and contribute their labor. Um, Warren made his living on the precarity of the sea. He also worked as a volunteer lifesaver. Um, and ultimately, he did meet his death responding to the same Circassian disaster that took Franklin Bunn from us earlier in this presentation. So why are we talking about this today? One of the main reasons is that we don't always focus enough on Native contributions to the global story um, or to their place in Long Island history. We also don't talk enough about whaling, and we definitely don't talk enough about what women have done historically to contribute to large global movements. So the work of these Native whalers and fishermen is only part of a larger story of Long Island history and Long Island Native contributions to global labor. Shinnecock and Montaukett women on 19th century Long Island, they labored in the spaces we expect to find them, but also in some of these most masculinized industries of the time. And that's a story that doesn't get told. Without the work of these women, the whaling industry most likely would not have been as successful because there wouldn't have been such a ready and supported pool of labor to draw from. So whenever I undertake a local history project, I think it's really important to talk about the sources that I use because anyone can be a historian if you know where to look and if you know how to use your sources. So to put together this research, I used federal census records, especially from 1850, 1870, 1900, and 1910. I looked at the New York Census records from 1865, U.S. federal mortality schedules, Civil War enlistments, oral histories, especially those done by Nancy Shoemaker with the Shinnecock. I looked at historic newspapers, historic diaries and letters, historic invoices for labor, and more. I also it was an interesting project in that to make sense of the people I was talking about and to understand the community I was looking at, I actually had to do genealogy and build out a map to trace everyone's relations to each other, to understand the puzzle pieces and how this worked, and people's movement within these communities. In terms of secondary sources, I drew from historical research that had been done by Nancy Shoemaker, Tara Hunter, John Strong. I looked at museum exhibits, historical archaeology publications, especially those done by Emily Button on Long Island. I also looked at fisheries research into food production, gendered history, and so much more. Really important, I looked at talks given by the Shinnecock, at descendants of some of the people that we've actually been talking about. Sandy Brewster Walker gave a phenomenal talk about her ancestors' work within the whaling industry. And that piece was located at the Suffolk County Historical Museum, and I found a lot of value in that. So I am ready for any questions you may have for me.
Video.
Okay.
I have two related questions.
Mhm.
First of all, you said that the whalers would go out for say 4 to 6 years.
Mhm.
I'm guessing they weren't on board for 4 to 6 years. They must have had stops and
Yes.
yeah, and they probably stopped for I don't know weeks at least, maybe more, depending on the weather.
So they would stop at different ports all over the world to refuel. They'd need to, take on more food, more water. I mean, these ships are also out for 4 or 5 years at a time. They would definitely need repairs. We do have situations that we hear about in which, while chasing whales, the whales actually struck back. So we have the story of the Essex, and that was a whale ship that came out of Nantucket and was actually rammed by a sperm whale. Now, that ship had undergone repairs before, and at this point, the ship actually sank, and the men had to survive in little whaleboats. That's where the movie and the book In the Heart of the Sea comes from. I don't know if you've read that one, but yeah, it was really important that these ships do stop and do maintenance. They do repairs. They take on new food. Sometimes, if they lost a crew member, they'd want to employ a new one. They would also mail their letters. And even while at sea, some of these ships would have contact with each other. If one whale ship passed another, they would stop, and it would be called gamming. And that's when, they'd exchange letters with each other if one was going closer to home and the other wasn't. They'd exchange news. They'd say, oh, we ran into a pod of whales back by New Zealand, or, oh, this part of the fishery really isn't good this year. But yeah, they're not on the boat for the entire 5 years at a time.
Which, okay, that leads to my second question, which, because I'm trying to picture what was going on with these guys. Now, if somebody was gone for 4 years, let's say somebody here today, say they were making $50,000 a year,
Mm-hmm.
and they're gone for 4 years. When they come back, do they have, do they have a majority of that money available now to help their family? Or, I mean, how much do they really contribute to their family?
So you wouldn't make money off your first whaling voyage. You would have boys as young as 14 years old signing up for their first voyage. And when you're 14, you're not very well prepared for the industry. You may have a mother, and she's probably working on supplying your father with all of his equipment. You may come on with some of your equipment, but not everything. So at the end of your first voyage, you would most likely end up owing money to the captain and have to sign on for your second. As you rose through the ranks, your earning potential did increase. And you could walk away with a sizable profit, but not always. So the benefit was that they would walk away if they were successful, if the whale ship had encountered enough whales and filled enough barrels. They would walk away with a larger chunk of money than if they had worked on land. But you have such an element of chance in this industry. If you did not find a lot of whales, if the ship had sustained so much damage that it could not go on, if your oil barrels were damaged and the oil leaked out, you could have a very unsuccessful voyage. And the later we get into the whaling period, the more unsuccessful these voyages are due to overfishing. So now you've overharvested so many whales that the population numbers are going down, and you can't sustain this industry. You can't hire people when they're not going to walk away with the funding they need. I mean, if you're putting in 5 years of work on a boat, you need to walk away with a proportionate income.
Yeah, I'm thinking that when they got home, their wives would like to see more than a couple of dollars.
Of course.
Okay.
I have a question about the oil. I don't quite understand. They put the oil in barrels, and after a point, do they unload these barrels, or do they just keep them on ship until they come back after a number of years, or do they have other places they can sell the oil to?
So as far as I understand it, you have the owner of, the whaling company or the whaling ship. Under that, you have captain, first mate, second mate, third mate, crew. Um, so really, you're working for the owner of the company. And upon your return at the very end, that's when you offload all of your oil. And the oil comes from the blubber of the whale, which has to essentially be boiled and melted down into oil, which could then be sold as oil and also wax for candles. Um, so really, there were ships that went out and were told not to come back until they had filled all of the barrels in their hold. So really, it was at the end that they would do the offload process and really find out what they made.
And so the captain was in charge of the money. He would hold or keep track then of what everybody is owed. He was kind of like the banker.
So the captain would keep track of, the number of whales they had taken and barrels filled, and the expenses his crew members had incurred on the ship. So the captain is almost like your mining store company, your mining company store person, where he's keeping a record of so and so bought this, so and so bought this, and at the end that's deducted. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, wonderful.
It's possible that's it, unless anybody has any other questions.
And it's a system that's so alien to the way that we think now about work and family relationships. It's hard to imagine living in this system where your father, your brother, your husband is gone for 5 years at a time. But yeah, this it's very interesting, and I think part of it is because it's so different from how we live now.
All right, Erin. Well, thank you very much. It was good having you here tonight.
Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you.